When elderly housekeeper Margaret Thatcher faces years of humiliation and invisibility under millionaire Richard Hastings, her dignity starts to shatter. But when a slip by her boss reveals a devastating truth, a new determination awakens in her. With the help of Richard's estranged grandson Joshua and journalist Harris, Margaret secures the evidence that could bring down Richard's corrupt empire. In a race against time, she risks everything to expose the dark secrets that have haunted the mansion for years. In a plot filled with tension, divided loyalties and sacrifice, Margaret faces the consequences of defying power. Will the voice of truth finally rise, or will she be silenced forever? Hello, viewer. Thank you for being here. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. Now let's continue with the story. The late afternoon light filtered through the towering, opulent windows of Richard Hastings' Manhattan mansion, casting a soft glow over the meticulously arranged banquet room. The scene was one of splendor. Chandeliers glittered like constellations above, reflecting in the polished marble floors. The scent of hors d'oeuvres wafted through the room, mingling with the distant hum of conversations and bursts of laughter from Richard's high-profile guests. Richard, a tall man with graying temples and a piercing gaze that conveyed both confidence and cold detachment, stood at the center, orchestrating the night with a nod here and a raised eyebrow there. Margaret Tuck, the housekeeper, moved through the crowd with the grace of someone who had spent decades navigating spaces filled with fine crystal and silver trays. Her hair, streaked with gray and pinned neatly back, bore witness to her 70 years, most of which had been spent toiling in households like Richard's. Her hands, calloused and worn from years of scrubbing and lifting, trembled slightly as she passed by a group of elegantly dressed guests. A sharp, dismissive laugh interrupted the steady hum of conversation. Margaret's heart tightened, and she knew without turning that Richard had found someone lacking. His voice, always polished with an edge of frost, rang out across the room. "Margaret, is that how you serve champagne in this house?" Richard's words sliced through the air like a blade. He approached, his tailored suit impeccable, his polished shoes soundless against the floor as he closed the distance between them. A few guests exchanged glances, intrigued by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she set the tray down carefully on a nearby table. "I apologize, Mr. Hastings," she murmured, her voice subdued, eyes downcast to avoid meeting his. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice but not softening it. "Your apologies are as tired as you are, Margaret. Remember your place." The remark lingered, sharp and humiliating. Heads turned subtly, guests feigning polite indifference while straining to catch every word. The sting of the reprimand was more than just words. It cut deeper, a reminder of the decades spent in similar rooms, under the watchful eyes of men like Richard. But tonight, for reasons she couldn't name, Margaret felt something stir within her, a flicker of defiance that had been buried beneath years of duty and silence. A sudden movement by the doorway caught her eye. Elise, one of the younger maids, watched with wide, fearful eyes, a forgotten napkin in her grasp. Margaret turned her gaze back to the tray, lifting it with steadying hands. She nodded once, and Richard's gaze drifted away, already bored with the scene. The room resumed its liveliness, the brief spectacle dismissed. But for Margaret, the moment had branded itself into her memory. As she retreated to the kitchen, where the clattering of dishes and the hiss of steam offered temporary solace, she couldn't shake the sound of his voice, the way it dripped with disdain. In that moment, as she stood in the sweltering heat of the kitchen, surrounded by the noise and bustle of the other staff, Margaret knew that something fundamental had shifted. A resolve was growing, like an ember sparked into life. Margaret sat on the small stool in her narrow room, hidden away in the servants' quarters at the back of Richard Hastings' mansion. The night was quiet now, the echo of laughter and clinking glasses from the grand rooms above fading into the silence that enveloped her. She reached for the well-worn diary on her bedside table, fingers tracing its frayed edges. It was a relic of her younger days, back when she had first come to New York as a fresh-faced young woman, full of dreams that had long since dissolved into routines and duty. 70 years had marked her with deep lines, not just on her face but on her spirit. She had been a widow for over 20 years, losing her husband, Thomas, in an accident that robbed her of the only source of joy she had known. With Thomas, life had been simple and earnest, filled with shared laughter despite the humble means they lived by. His death left a hollow so vast that even her two daughters, both grown and scattered now, couldn't fill it. They visited sparingly, their lives caught up in careers and grandchildren, the hustle of cities that had pulled them far from her. Margaret's world was this mansion. Every speck of dust wiped, every floor polished, was a testament to years of service. Richard's father had been a different man, strict, yes, but capable of moments of unexpected kindness. It was under his watch that Margaret had found herself offering quiet smiles and polite nods, earning a silent respect. But with Richard, everything was different. The warmth of the household had been replaced by cold efficiency. He was a man who valued power, who measured worth by the breadth of influence and the weight of currency. She sighed and set the diary aside, eyes catching her reflection in the small, cracked mirror propped against the wall. The grey in her hair seemed more pronounced tonight, glistening silver under the soft glow of the lamp. The humiliation from the party replayed in her mind, his words like barbs that stuck and twisted, "Remember your place." The reminder struck a nerve she didn't know was still raw. Her place. For decades, Margaret had believed that her place was among the whispers and shadows, in rooms meant for serving and not speaking. She had accepted it all. The grueling hours, the condescending glances, the sense of invisibility. But something about Richard's tone, the look in his eyes that night, was different. It was a stripping of dignity, an assertion that she was not even human in his world of glistening chandeliers and tailored suits. She remembered the years after Thomas's death, when she had briefly considered leaving the service life to seek something different. But then reality, harsh and unforgiving, reminded her that there were bills to pay and daughters to raise. Margaret settled back into her role, numbing herself to the daily grind, allowing herself only the luxury of dreams she never spoke of. Outside, a light drizzle began, the gentle patter against the window, a soothing rhythm that filled the silence. The rain always brought back memories of London, where she was born. The foggy mornings, the narrow streets lined with shops, and the hum of conversations in cafes, where she never had the time nor the means to sit. Her father, a cobbler, had worked tirelessly to put bread on the table, his hands rough like hers were now. He used to tell her stories of resilience, tales of people who rose from the ashes of hardship with quiet determination. Those stories had carried her here, across the Atlantic, searching for something better, only to find herself bound to the same unending cycle of work. Margaret's thoughts drifted to the faces of the younger staff at the mansion. Elise, with her shy smile and nimble hands, always apologizing for the slightest mistake. Or Samuel, the footman, whose laughter was rare but genuine when it broke free. They looked up to Margaret, saw her as a pillar of the household, and yet that pillar felt hollow tonight. A knock at the door startled her. It was Elise, hesitant and small in the doorway. "Mrs. Thatcher, I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, eyes darting around as though fearing reprimand. "I just wanted to see if you were all right after earlier." Margaret's heart softened. She stood, reaching out to squeeze Elise's hand gently. "I'm fine, dear," she said, forcing a smile. "Go on now, it's late." Elise nodded, still uncertain, and retreated back down the hall. Margaret watched her go, the moment of kindness cutting through the lingering shame like a balm. It wasn't much, but it reminded her that she was more than a servant. She was a woman who had lived, loved, and lost. She was a mother, a widow, a soul who deserved to be seen, not just as a worker, but as a person. The rain grew heavier, and Margaret stood by the window, the chill of the glass seeping into her skin. This life, these rooms, this city, they had defined her for so long, but something stirred within her, something that told her this was not the end. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses echoed down the hallway as Margaret arranged a final tray of glasses in the pantry. The evening had stretched longer than usual. Richard's gatherings were renowned not just for their extravagance, but also for their demanding nature. The staff moved like a well-rehearsed troupe, each member silently acknowledging the other, their roles defined by countless evenings like this one. Margaret had done her rounds, avoiding Richard's cold, calculating gaze. She felt a tautness in her chest, a residue from the earlier humiliation that still stung. As the night wore on, Margaret's body moved out of habit, muscle memory guiding her through tasks while her mind lingered on distant, softer moments. The room filled with a warm, indistinct buzz as the guests' chatter blended into a pleasant hum. She adjusted the folds of her plain, starched apron and took the tray into the dining room, where the guests mingled under the glow of chandeliers. "Careful, Margaret," warned Samuel, the young footman, with a quick glance as he passed. He offered her a look of concern, one that reminded her of her own sons when they were young and worried for her well-being. She managed a small nod, hiding the ache behind her professional smile. Then, it happened. Margaret's attention slipped just a moment as she maneuvered between a guest gesturing broadly with a wine glass and another turning abruptly to converse. The tray tipped slightly in her hands, and time seemed to stutter. A glass of red wine slid free, arcing gracefully before crashing onto the lap of a guest, a prominent city council member whose suits were known to cost more than Margaret's yearly wages. Gasps erupted around her, the room's convivial atmosphere disrupted like a cracked mirror. Margaret's face flushed as she whispered apologies, fumbling with a napkin to blot at the darkening stain. The council member stood stiffly, his indignation visible, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Before anyone could intercede, Richard's voice cut through the room, sharp and unforgiving. "Margaret, enough!" He stepped forward, his features composed but eyes gleaming with irritation. "You've done quite enough for tonight," he said, each word dropping with the weight of finality. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their expressions caught between empathy and the desire to remain unnoticed. Margaret felt the humiliation swell like a tide, pushing against her chest and rising into her throat. She stepped back, leaving the napkin crumpled on the edge of the table, and dropped her gaze. "I'm sorry, sir," she managed, her voice shaking but measured. Richard's eyes narrowed, his mouth twisting with a flicker of disdain. "You're sorry. How charmingly predictable." The dismissal stung. There was no room left for dignity, only the heat of shame. Margaret walked quickly back to the kitchen, the echoes of murmured gossip trailing after her like specters. Once past the swinging doors, she pressed her hands against the counter, the cold metal steadying her as the weight of the moment settled heavily. The silence of the kitchen contrasted starkly with the ongoing festivities outside. Elise approached, eyes wide with worry, her voice a whisper. "Are you all right, Mrs. Thatcher?" Margaret couldn't find words. The kitchen felt too small, the air too heavy. She nodded, though it was as much to reassure herself as Elise. The truth was, she wasn't all right. Not tonight, not after being stripped of the last thread of pride she had managed to cling to in Richard Hastings' house. Hours later, as the final guest departed and the echoes of their laughter receded into the night, Margaret sat alone on the bench by the window, her eyes fixed on the city lights that glimmered beyond the estate's manicured garden. The exhaustion seeped deeper than her bones. It touched the part of her that had endured and bent, but never broken until now. The memory of the spilled wine, the stain it left not just on fabric, but on her spirit, weighed on her. There was something unbearable about being humiliated not just in private, but under the indifferent eyes of others. She relived the moment, the sharpness of Richard's voice, the amused pity in the eyes of the guests, and it stirred something raw and restless within her, a whisper of defiance, of a long-lost courage that had been smothered by years of obedience, began to rise. Margaret wiped the corner of her eye, a single tear catching the dim light before falling. She straightened her back, feeling the first tremors of determination lace through her exhaustion. Tonight was not just another moment to be endured and then forgotten. It was something more, a reminder that beneath the surface of quiet compliance, a spark still flickered, and for the first time in years, Margaret dared to wonder what would happen if she fanned it into a flame. The stillness of the house after a party always carried a unique kind of echo. Margaret sat on the edge of her small cot, staring at her fingers intertwined on her lap, their joints stiff and aching from years of scrubbing, lifting and serving. The night outside hummed with a low murmur of rain, its steady patter a welcome distraction from the silent tumult inside her chest. The embarrassment from earlier had set into her bones, weighing her down with a weariness that felt older than her 70 years. With a heavy sigh, she stood up and moved to the small wooden desk in the corner of her room. It was an old thing, chipped and worn, but it had been with her through thick and thin, a silent witness to her nights spent writing letters she never sent and recording memories she tried not to forget. She reached into the back of the drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound book, Thomas's Ledger. It was one of the few possessions she had kept from her late husband, its pages filled with his careful, precise handwriting detailing work, dreams, and plans for the future they never got to see together. As she ran her fingers over the worn cover, a distant noise caught her attention. The sound came from down the hall near Richard's study. Her brow furrowed as she listened, the sound of muffled voices and footsteps stirring her curiosity. She knew the rest of the staff had retired to their quarters. Only Richard would linger in his study at this hour, accompanied, perhaps, by a business associate too immersed in late-night negotiations. Yet, something about the hushed tones and hurried shuffling didn't sit right with her. Hesitant but driven by a sudden, inexplicable need, Margaret pushed herself to her feet and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. The hallway was dimly lit, the shadows stretching and shifting as she moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. She paused outside Richard's study. The faint glow of a lamp spilling out through the narrow gap of the door left ajar. The voices grew clearer. Richard's sharp, authoritative tone was unmistakable, laced with irritation, but there was another voice, lower, unfamiliar. It spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other as though trying to outrun an unseen consequence. "Not a chance I'm taking," the stranger's voice hissed. "If this leaks, it's not just your name on the line, Hastings." There was a pause. The silence so thick, Margaret could hear her own heart thudding in her chest. She felt the weight of the moment pressing against her, every instinct telling her to step back, to pretend she hadn't ventured this far into a space not meant for her. But she remained rooted, her curiosity stoked by the tone in the man's voice, a note of desperation, not the typical business banter exchanged at such hours. "Nothing will come of it." Richard's reply was firm, dismissive, as if sealing the matter with his voice alone. We've covered everything. Just keep your end of the agreement. Margaret's pulse quickened. The implications were tangled, uncertain, but the urgency in the conversation painted a picture far from the pristine world Richard Hastings displayed to his guests. Before she could gather her thoughts, a sound of papers shuffling sharply cut through the air, followed by footsteps approaching the door. She darted back into the shadows, pressing her back against the wall as the door creaked open. A man in an expensive but hastily donned coat stepped out, glancing left and right with eyes that gleamed like dark glass under the light. He moved down the hall without noticing her, the rhythmic clack of his shoes on the marble fading as he left. Richard remained behind the door, its frame casting a tall shadow that seemed to loom over the corridor. Margaret held her breath as he paused, then closed the door with a deliberate click. The hallway returned to its stillness, but the night had changed for Margaret. She pressed a trembling hand against her chest, feeling the thrum of her heart as she turned away, a deep sense of unease coiling in her gut. The ledger in her hand felt heavier now, the past and present intertwining in a way she hadn't felt in decades. The brief glimpse into Richard's private dealings, the tenor of their conversation, spoke of something more than mere business, a kind of danger she couldn't yet name. Returning to her room, she set the ledger on the desk, but her mind was no longer with the words Thomas had penned long ago. The idea that there was more to Richard's world than she had ever known or cared to know gnawed at her, an unwelcome revelation that threatened to disrupt the steady, predictable rhythm of her life. As the rain beat against the window, Margaret sat on her cot, eyes fixed on the dim outlines of the room. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm within her, the first whispers of a resolve that no longer allowed her to be simply a witness in a house where she had spent her life in silence. The morning light crept cautiously into Margaret's modest room, painting the walls in pale streaks of gold. The world beyond her window was still awakening, the city's din distant but persistent. The previous night's events clung to her thoughts, trailing her as she prepared for the day. She moved mechanically, fingers deftly fastening the buttons of her uniform, while her mind circled around the conversation she had overheard. The stranger's voice and Richard's cold assurance replayed in fragments, each piece fueling an unease that refused to fade. As the mansion stirred to life, Margaret found herself moving through its familiar halls with a heightened awareness. The chatter of the other servants seemed muted, their laughter distant and foreign. She offered polite nods, maintaining the composed mask she had worn for years, but the turmoil within her was anything but calm. Mid-morning brought an unexpected summons. Mr. Walter, one of Richard's longtime business associates, a man whose stature commanded respect and who bore an ever-watchful eye, appeared at the kitchen entrance. His presence alone was enough to quiet the room. "Margaret, Mr. Hastings wishes to see you in the study," he announced, his tone flat and unreadable. A few of the maids exchanged nervous glances, the air thick with speculation. Summons to Richard's study were rare for staff, especially without reason. Margaret felt her heart tighten. She wiped her hands on her apron to mask the trembling and followed Walter down the corridor. The journey felt longer than it should, each step echoing with a foreboding that matched the weight in her chest. The door to Richard's study loomed, slightly ajar, as if beckoning her into its realm of polished mahogany and shadowed corners. Walter pushed it open and gestured for her to enter, the creak of the hinges cutting through the silence. Richard sat behind a vast oak desk, his posture impeccable, eyes glinting under the sunlight that sliced through the half-drawn curtains. Papers lay scattered across the polished surface, and the faint scent of tobacco hung in the air. Margaret stood just inside the threshold, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Margaret." Richard's voice was cool, devoid of any greeting. He leaned back in his chair, the creak of the leather accentuating the moment. "I trust you're aware that this household runs on precision and loyalty," She nodded once, a subtle, controlled gesture. "Yes, sir." Richard's gaze was as sharp as the first time she had met him, when he had taken over his father's estate with an efficiency that left no room for sentiment. He studied her for a moment, eyes narrowing as if weighing her worth anew. "There are changes coming," he continued, voice edged with the same cold resolve she had heard the night before. "I need my staff to be discreet." The silence that followed was more telling than any word. Margaret felt the shift, the unsaid things that hung between them. He was aware of something, but how much? The question pressed at her, but she dared not move, dared not breathe too audibly. "Yes, sir," she said again, the words steadier than she felt. Richard's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile, but more of an acknowledgement. He tapped a paper on his desk, a rhythmic drumming that seemed to echo in her ears long after he had stopped. "That will be all." Margaret inclined her head and turned to leave, the creak of the door as she pulled it closed behind her feeling like a reprieve. She walked back through the hallway, the grand paintings on the walls looking down at her, silent witnesses to this new shift. The mansion felt different, as though its ornate beauty concealed secrets that were now seeping out like ink on paper. Before she could fully collect her thoughts, Samuel approached, a rare frown creasing his usually composed face. "Margaret, you need to hear this," he whispered, glancing around to ensure no one else was within earshot. He led her into a small storage room near the back of the house, its shelves lined with linens and silver polish. The smell of lavender and cleaning oil was almost comforting. Samuel's voice dropped even lower, urgency etched into each word. "One of the footmen overheard Mr. Walter speaking with Mr. Hastings this morning. There's talk of a move, something about assets and changes in control. He didn't catch everything, but it's big, Margaret." The flutter of anxiety stirred to life again. This wasn't just a passing concern, it was something that threatened the very fabric of her world. She recalled the ledger in her room, the whispers of Thomas's voice in her memories, urging her to take heed, to stand firm when the ground shook. "Thank you, Samuel," she whispered, the gratitude genuine but masked by the strain in her voice. Back in her room, Margaret sat down at the edge of her cot, the narrow strip of morning sun falling across her lap. The mansion felt less like a home than ever before, and more like a grand stage set for a drama she had unwittingly stepped into. Margaret moved through the mansion with a newfound awareness, a subtle vigilance that made her notice the smallest shifts. A strained smile from Samuel, the quiet urgency in Elise's steps. Whispers crept through the staff quarters like a draft under a locked door. The air buzzed with the undercurrent of change, an electric anticipation that neither belonged nor felt entirely safe. After her encounter with Richard in the study, Margaret found herself drawn to the library in the evenings. The vast, wood-paneled room was lined with books whose spines spoke of long-forgotten opulence and authors who had captured worlds between pages. There, in the quiet, she sought solace in the written word, turning pages to distract her thoughts, though her eyes skimmed sentences without absorbing them. Tonight, however, was different. The heavy tome she selected slipped from her grasp as she reached for it, landing with a muted thud. The noise was enough to make Elise, who was tidying the hearth nearby, glance up with concern. Margaret bent to pick it up, but as she did, a small, folded piece of paper dislodged from between the pages and floated gently to the floor. She paused, fingers hovering over it, before curiosity urged her to unfold it. The handwriting was Richard's, unmistakable with its harsh, angled script. Her eyes traced the hurried strokes, deciphering fragments that spoke of assets, names she didn't recognize, and phrases that hinted at subterfuge. The implications sank into her, unsettling and stark. "Mrs. Thatcher, is everything all right?" Elise's voice was soft, but Margaret heard the worry in it. She quickly refolded the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket, straightening with a nod that she hoped masked her inner turmoil. "Yes, Elise, just a clumsy moment," Margaret replied, managing a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She glanced at the mantelpiece clock. The ticking seemed louder than usual, filling the room with a rhythmic reminder of time slipping away. "It's late. You should head to bed." Elise hesitated, her eyes lingering on Margaret's face, as if sensing the shift in her. "Good night, Mrs. Thatcher," she finally said, retreating down the hall, the soft swish of her skirts fading into the distance. Alone in the dim library, Margaret sank into one of the high-backed chairs, the weight of the paper in her pocket pressing against her side. The mansion's usual grandeur now felt like a facade, each polished surface reflecting back secrets she could no longer ignore. Her heart thudded with the realization that whatever Richard was entangled in reached far beyond the usual scandals whispered in corners. The following days only heightened her apprehension. Richard's associates came and went with more frequency, their expressions tight and their conversations clipped. The staff, while obedient, moved with the caution of those aware that they might be observed. Margaret noticed Samuel's furtive glances toward the study door and the way Elise's chatter dwindled whenever footsteps approached. It was during one such quiet afternoon that Margaret found herself summoned once more to the study. This time, however, an unexpected visitor awaited her. Benjamin Crowley, a man known for his dealings as a lawyer and once a close confidant of Richard's late father, stood by the window, fingers drumming a restless pattern against the glass. He turned when Margaret entered, his eyes shadowed with something she could only interpret as worry. "Margaret," he said, the familiarity in his tone unsettling. "You've been here long enough to understand how this household operates, haven't you?" She swallowed, the taste of caution sharp on her tongue. "Yes, Mr. Crowley, I know my place." A faint smile tugged at his lips, though it was devoid of humor. "Your place, Mrs. Thatcher, may soon be tested." Before she could respond, Richard entered, the tension preceding him like a storm. His eyes flicked to Benjamin, then to Margaret, narrowing as if gauging what had transpired in the moments before his arrival. "Crowley, I didn't expect you to make your concerns public," Richard said, his voice smooth but laced with irritation. "Some things can't wait," Crowley replied, folding his arms. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the two men sized each other up. Margaret stood rooted, a silent witness to the exchange, her pulse drumming loudly in her ears. She knew she should excuse herself, but Richard's gaze locked her in place, as if daring her to challenge the command embedded within. "Margaret, you may go," Richard finally said, voice clipped. But as she turned, she caught the fleeting glance between the men. A signal, a silent acknowledgement of something dark and complicated. The weight of that look followed her out, pressing against her back like a shroud. In her small room that night, the paper she had hidden felt like a brand, its contents sparking questions that burned behind her eyes. Margaret knew that whatever was to come would test her resolve, not just as a housekeeper, but as a woman whose dignity was no longer content to be buried beneath obligation. The morning after Margaret's encounter with Benjamin Crowley, the mansion seemed cloaked in an uneasy silence. The usual sounds, the rustle of starched uniforms, the metallic clang of silverware, the soft, polite murmurs, felt subdued, as if everyone were holding their breath. Margaret moved through her tasks with a mechanical precision, but the paper hidden in her pocket pressed against her side, a constant reminder of the storm gathering within those grand walls. Richard Hastings had become an even more imposing figure in the days that followed. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, seemed to catch every flicker of movement, every whisper that strayed too close to discontent. Margaret felt his gaze linger on her more often than before, making her spine stiffen under the weight of suspicion. It was as if he sensed the shift in her, the quiet rebellion simmering beneath her surface. Elise, usually quick with a smile or a word of comfort, had grown anxious, her eyes darting nervously as she worked. Samuel, too, seemed more reserved, his jokes fewer, his laughter gone. Margaret could see the tension chipping away at the staff's resolve, turning once warm faces cold with fear. One afternoon, as Margaret was polishing the silver candelabras in the dining hall, she felt a prickle at the back of her neck. She turned, and there was Richard, standing at the threshold, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. He stepped inside, the polished wood floor creaking under his weight. "Margaret," he said, his tone clipped. It was not a greeting, but a summons. She put down the cloth and met his gaze with what she hoped was composure. "Yes, sir." The room was suddenly too bright, the sunlight pooling in harsh spots on the polished table and reflecting off the silver, almost blinding in its intensity. Richard moved closer, his hands clasped behind his back, the fabric of his suit barely whispering as he walked. "I've noticed some changes in the atmosphere here," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "There's an unease that I find unsettling." Margaret swallowed, the dryness in her throat making the act painful. "I haven't noticed anything unusual, sir," she replied, her voice steady but quiet. A small, sardonic smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I hope that's true, for everyone's sake." His eyes lingered on her for a beat longer before he turned and walked away, leaving the air heavy with unspoken threats. As soon as he disappeared down the hallway, Margaret exhaled shakily, her hands trembling as she picked up the cloth again. The silver glinted back at her, each candelabra a silent witness to what had just transpired. She pressed the cloth harder, as if trying to scrub away not just the tarnish, but the gnawing anxiety that had taken root inside her. That evening, Samuel found her in the pantry, surrounded by jars of preserves and neatly stacked linens. He closed the door softly behind him, his expression grave. "Margaret, you need to be careful. Richard's been asking questions, more than usual. He's watching you," he whispered, the urgency in his voice cutting through the quiet. "I know," she replied, folding her arms across her chest, seeking warmth in the cold room. The confession that sat on her tongue about the paper she had found, the meeting with Crowley, remained unspoken. She couldn't risk implicating Samuel or anyone else. Samuel's brow furrowed. "If there's something happening, something dangerous." "Don't worry about me," Margaret interrupted, forcing a reassuring smile. "I've seen storms before." The words rang hollow, even to her own ears, but Samuel nodded reluctantly and left her alone, the creak of the pantry door fading into silence. The hours crept by that night, each one heavier than the last. Margaret sat by her window, the folded paper on her lap. The city lights outside blinked like watchful eyes, indifferent to her turmoil. The secrets she now carried had begun to take shape, coiling and shifting like a living thing. Richard was aware of something, but how much, and how long until he acted on it? A sudden knock startled her, sharp and unexpected in the stillness. She hid the paper quickly beneath her mattress and opened the door to find Elise standing there, her face pale and eyes wide. "There's been a summons for all staff," Elise said, her voice a thin thread. "Richard wants everyone in the main hall." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she nodded, following Elise down the corridor where other servants were gathering, their whispers silenced by the looming presence of Richard Hastings at the top of the grand staircase. He stood there, backlit by the chandelier, a silhouette of power and cold intent. Margaret's heart pounded as she joined the others, the room pressing in on her from all sides. Whatever was about to happen would test not just her resolve, but the fragile ties that bound the people in this house to one another. And deep down, she knew that the moment of reckoning was drawing near. Margaret stood among the gathered staff in the main hall, the murmurs fading into silence as Richard descended the staircase. The grandeur of the space, with its gleaming marble and chandeliers casting shards of light across the room, seemed almost suffocating. Every step Richard took resonated, each one a drumbeat of impending confrontation. Margaret's gaze drifted to Samuel, who stood a few feet away, his jaw set tightly, and then to Elise, whose wide eyes betrayed her fear. Richard reached the bottom step and surveyed the room, his sharp eyes moving deliberately across the gathered faces. There was no warmth in his expression, only the cold calculation of a man who knew his power was being tested. "Some of you may have noticed a certain tension in the air," he began, his voice smooth but laced with steel. "I am not one to tolerate distractions or disloyalty." A shiver ran through the room, invisible but felt. Margaret kept her posture straight, meeting his gaze when it swept past her with a composure she did not feel. Richard's eyes lingered on her for just a moment too long before moving on, but it was enough to send her heart racing. Before he could continue, there was a noise from the back of the hall, the creak of the heavy front door opening. Heads turned as a young man stepped in, shaking rainwater from his coat. He was tall, with a lean frame and unruly dark hair that fell into his eyes. Margaret's breath caught in her chest when she recognized him. Joshua Hastings, Richard's estranged grandson. The murmur that had silenced returned in a wave of whispers. Joshua had always been the anomaly in the Hastings lineage, favoring his mother's idealism and pursuit of justice over the rigid, profit-driven empire built by his grandfather. His return was unexpected and, by the look of Richard's tightening jaw, unwelcome. "Joshua," Richard said, his voice carrying a strained patience. "I was not expecting you." Joshua nodded, a smile flickering briefly across his lips. "I thought it was time I paid a visit, grandfather. I heard there's been unrest." Richard's face darkened, but he masked it quickly. "Family matters are no concern of the staff," he said, turning back to the crowd. "Return to your duties." The staff dispersed reluctantly, the air crackling with unspoken questions. Margaret moved toward the kitchen, but before she reached the door, Joshua's voice cut through the departing noise. "Mrs. Thatcher, may I have a word?" She froze, sensing Richard's gaze burn into her back before she turned to face Joshua. His eyes, softer than Richard's but no less perceptive, met hers. The room was nearly empty now, save for a few lingering glances. "Yes, of course," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she expected. He led her to the corner of the hall where they were out of earshot. The rain outside tapped against the tall windows, a rhythm that seemed to echo the tension within her. "I've heard a lot about you," Joshua said, folding his arms as he leaned against the wall. "My mother used to mention you in her letters." Margaret's heart ached at the memory of Richard's late daughter, a rare light in the mansion's history. "She was a kind soul," Margaret replied, the hint of a smile touching her lips before vanishing. Joshua's expression softened. "I believe you know more than most here, Mrs. Thatcher. I need to know what's happening in this house. There's talk of financial misdeeds, but it's more than that, isn't it?" The question hung in the air, the weight of trust and risk heavy on her shoulders. Margaret hesitated, the folded paper hidden in her room, suddenly feeling like a burning brand. Her eyes shifted to the hallway where Richard had disappeared moments before. Could she trust Joshua? Was this a trap? The storm within her wrestled with the need to protect those she cared for and the fear of stepping into deeper waters. "It's not safe," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not for you, and not for anyone who questions too much." Joshua's jaw tightened, a flicker of frustration passing over his face. "Then let's change that," he said, determination hardening his voice. "You're not alone in this, Margaret. But we need to act before it's too late." The rain's patter seemed louder now, mingling with the low hum of voices from the kitchen. Margaret's eyes met Joshua's, and for the first time in years, she felt the fragile stirrings of hope. Yet, she knew that hope alone could not be trusted to save them. "Be careful," she whispered, a warning and a plea. Joshua nodded, his eyes never leaving hers as he stepped back into the hallway, a silent promise lingering between them. Margaret turned away, her hands cold and clammy as she moved through the kitchen and back to her small room. She sat down, staring at the empty chair across from her. The silence enveloped her, but it no longer felt like the comfort of old routines. It was the calm before the storm, and she was caught in its eye, with only a thin, fraying thread of hope to cling to. The mansion held its breath. The presence of Joshua Hastings, a figure whose ideals clashed so fiercely with the values upheld by his grandfather, had set the house on edge. Margaret felt the shift in the air, a tension that coiled tighter with every passing day. She moved through her duties with the practiced ease of decades, but beneath the surface, her thoughts churned like stormy waters. A week had passed since Joshua's unexpected arrival, and Richard's vigilance had only intensified. He prowled the halls, appearing suddenly in doorways or at the foot of staircases, eyes sharp and searching. The staff, sensing his unease, tread carefully, their conversations reduced to whispers. Margaret kept to herself, her mind burdened by the folded paper hidden in her room and the cryptic conversation she'd had with Joshua. One evening, as the staff cleared away the remnants of a dinner marked by strained silences, Margaret found herself alone in the drawing room. The room was filled with shadows, the only light coming from the flickering fire that cast a warm glow over the deep green armchairs and walnut bookshelves. She paused, the weight of exhaustion settling over her like a shawl. It was then that Elise appeared in the doorway, her hands nervously clutching her apron. "Mrs. Thatcher," she said, her voice low, eyes darting to the hallway. "Can we talk, just for a moment?" Margaret nodded, motioning for her to come in. Elise stepped inside, her young face drawn tight with worry. "I don't know what's happening, but Mr. Hastings has been speaking to Mr. Crowley again," Elise whispered. "Samuel said he overheard something about loose ends needing to be tied." The words sent a chill through Margaret, the weight of their meaning settling heavy in her chest. She reached for Elise's hand, squeezing it gently. "We must be cautious. Whatever Richard is planning, we need to be ready." Elise's eyes shone with unshed tears. "But what can we do? We're just the staff. He holds all the power." Margaret's gaze softened, a mix of sadness and resolve. "Power is not just in wealth or position, Elise. Sometimes it's in knowing the truth and holding on to it until the right moment." Before Elise could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway, and they both turned instinctively. Joshua stood in the doorway, his expression a blend of urgency and determination. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. "Mrs. Thatcher, Elise," he began, his voice steady but low. "We don't have much time. My grandfather's actions are escalating. I need to know if there's anything that can link him to questionable dealings." Margaret's breath caught, the paper hidden under her mattress pressing against her thoughts. She hesitated, torn between protecting herself and those she cared for, and seizing the chance to end the reign of intimidation that had defined Richard's rule. "I may have found something," she said, each word carefully chosen. Joshua's eyes sharpened, the firelight catching the intensity in his gaze. Elise gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Then we need to act," Joshua said. "Tonight, Richard is meeting with Crowley in the study. If we can find more proof, we can stop him before things go further." Margaret's heart thudded painfully. She had spent years suppressing her own voice, binding herself to the silence of service, but this was different. This was a moment that would define not just her future, but the legacy of everyone under that roof. "I'll help," she said finally, the words a whisper of defiance and resolve. Joshua nodded, a flicker of respect passing between them. The night crept on as the household quieted, the grand clock in the hallway marking each hour with a solemn chime. Margaret and Elise lingered near the kitchen, feigning busy work while waiting for their moment. When the sound of footsteps finally receded down the hall and the muffled click of Richard's study door reached them, they exchanged a glance, the gravity of their plan shared silently. Joshua appeared at the edge of the corridor, motioning them forward. Margaret's hands trembled as she followed him, each step a defiance of the years spent believing she had no power. They reached the study door, where the light spilled out from beneath the heavy wood, like a secret waiting to be revealed. From inside, Richard's voice rose, sharper and more urgent than ever. "This needs to be handled tonight, Crowley. No more waiting." Margaret's pulse quickened. The truth was there. So close. Joshua met her eyes, and for the first time, Margaret felt that the scales of power had begun to shift, not with a shout, but with the quiet, unyielding resolve of those who had finally decided to fight. Margaret stood in the dimly lit hallway, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. The door to Richard's study was closed, but through the thick wood, his voice came in sharp fragments, each word edged with authority. Joshua moved with practiced quiet, positioning himself near the door's shadow, eyes flicking to Margaret as if seeking reassurance. The mansion, usually a fortress of order and routine, now felt like a living, breathing entity, every creak and whisper magnified in the silence. The staff had long retired for the night, their rooms bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and the occasional flicker of candlelight. Elise lingered at the far end of the corridor, her slender figure half hidden by the heavy velvet drapes. She kept watch, eyes wide and fingers twisting the edge of her apron. Margaret's heart thudded in her chest, the adrenaline mingling with memories long buried, memories of moments when she had let fear dictate her silence, when she had watched others suffer under the weight of power and said nothing. Tonight, that silence would end. Joshua motioned to Margaret, urging her closer. She stepped forward, the soft soles of her shoes barely making a sound on the polished floor. The muffled voices from inside the study grew clearer as she reached the door. "Has to be tonight, Crowley," Richard's voice said, a low growl that spoke of finality. "If we delay any longer, we risk everything. The board will not wait for excuses." Crowley's response was quieter, almost conciliatory. "I understand, but moving this quickly invites scrutiny. We need to ensure every detail is covered." Margaret exchanged a glance with Joshua, the shared understanding unspoken yet heavy between them. Whatever they were planning, it was enough to warrant immediate action. Her fingers brushed against the hidden pocket in her apron where she kept the paper she had found, its crinkled edges a reminder of the risks she was taking. The sound of footsteps echoed from deeper within the study. Richard's pacing was methodical, each step deliberate as he plotted and considered. Margaret's breath caught when the doorknob turned, and she stepped back quickly, pressing herself into the shadowed alcove just as the door creaked open. Crowley emerged first, his expression unreadable, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the corridor as if lost in thought. He adjusted the collar of his coat, the fabric rustling softly, and turned toward the main foyer, his pace brisk. Richard stood in the doorway for a moment, his gaze sweeping the hallway with a narrowed intensity. Margaret held her breath, willing herself to blend into the darkness. After a tense moment, he closed the door behind him and returned to the study. Joshua let out a slow exhale. "Now," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He pushed the door open just enough for them to slip inside. The study smelled of polished wood and tobacco, with papers scattered across the desk like autumn leaves. Margaret's eyes swept the room, taking in the framed portraits, the meticulously organized bookshelves, and the antique globe that stood by the window. Joshua moved with quiet purpose, rifling through the documents on the desk while Margaret watched the door. The seconds stretched into minutes, each tick of the grandfather clock a sharp reminder of time slipping through their fingers. Joshua's hands paused over a sheet, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the text. "This is it," he said, holding the paper out for Margaret to see. It was a ledger, similar to the one she kept as a memento of her late husband, but filled with figures that spoke of offshore accounts, hidden transactions, and payments that traced a shadowy line of deceit. A noise from the hallway jolted them both. Elise's silhouette appeared in the crack of the doorway, her urgent whisper barely reaching them. "Someone's coming!" Joshua tucked the ledger into his coat, and Margaret's pulse raced as they slipped out of the study, the tension between fear and resolve pulling at every nerve. They moved swiftly, the corridors a maze that they knew too well. When they reached the servants' quarters, the narrow, cluttered space felt like a sanctuary. Elise joined them, her breath coming in short gasps. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice shaking. Margaret nodded, a small, triumphant smile breaking through the tension, enough to make Richard think twice. The weight of their actions settled over them, the reality of what they had done taking shape in the silence that followed. Margaret felt the fragile pulse of hope beat stronger. It was only the beginning, but it was more than she had dared to believe possible. Joshua's eyes met hers, a look of determination softening with gratitude. "We'll need to move fast," he said. "Richard will suspect something is amiss." Margaret placed a hand on Elise's shoulder, steadying her. "Then we'll be ready." No more silence. As the first rays of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the shutters, the mansion seemed to hold its breath once more, poised at the edge of change. The early morning sun filtered through the mansion's lace curtains, casting long, delicate shadows across the polished floors. Margaret woke with a start, her heart pounding from dreams that left only a trace of unease as they dissolved into the waking world. The events of the previous night rushed back with startling clarity, making her pulse quicken. The ledger, the clandestine search in Richard's study, the newfound knowledge that could unravel everything. As she dressed, the house stirred to life with its usual symphony of footsteps and muffled voices. But today, the rhythm felt off, each sound imbued with an invisible tension. She caught Samuel in the hallway as he straightened his waistcoat, his expression sober. "Did you hear?" he asked, eyes flicking down the corridor to ensure they were alone. "Richard summoned Crowley again, and some of the board members are set to arrive." Margaret nodded, her mind racing. It was only a matter of time before Richard discovered the missing documents. She glanced around, spotting Elise carrying a tray of linens with unsteady hands. Their gazes met briefly, and Elise offered a small, strained smile before disappearing down the corridor. In the dining room, the clatter of silverware on china barely masked the low hum of voices. The board members' arrival added a weight to the atmosphere, their presence rare and usually reserved for matters of utmost importance. Margaret moved silently between tables, serving tea and clearing plates, listening for snippets of conversation. "This delay could cost us everything," one man said, his tone clipped and anxious. Richard's reply was measured but hard. "I am aware of the stakes, gentlemen. Rest assured, there are contingencies." Margaret's hands trembled as she placed a teacup on its saucer. The conversation confirmed her fears. Richard was preparing for something drastic. She felt the ledger's absence like a phantom limb, its incriminating contents now Joshua's responsibility to reveal. She retreated to the kitchen, her nerves stretched taut. Elise was there, her fingers worrying the hem of her apron. "Margaret, what do we do now? He'll realize soon enough." Margaret's eyes met Elise's, the younger woman's fear reflecting her own. "We stay vigilant," Margaret said, her voice calm despite the storm roiling within her. "And we prepare for whatever comes next." The minutes dragged on like hours, each tick of the grand clock in the hallway amplifying the silence. Then, like a thunderclap, Richard's voice shattered the quiet. "Where is she?" His words, sharp and cutting, echoed down the hall. The staff exchanged glances, fear darting across their faces like quicksilver. Margaret stiffened as Richard appeared, his eyes alight with fury. He moved like a predator, his gaze locking onto her as if she were the only person in the room. The space between them seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in. "Margaret," he said, his voice low but seething. "A word. Now." She followed him out, the silence in the room behind them palpable. He led her to the study, the heavy door closing with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. The room was dimly lit, the morning sun blocked by the thick curtains that cast deep shadows across the bookshelves and mahogany desk. Richard paced in front of her, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "You've been here a long time," he began, the words deceptively calm, "long enough to understand how things work in this house." Margaret met his gaze, the calmness she wore like a mask slipping slightly. "I do, sir." "Then you understand that loyalty is everything," Richard continued, stopping to lean forward, palms flat on the desk as he stared at her with eyes that missed nothing. "And betrayal, however subtle, will not be tolerated." The tension stretched thin, a fragile line between silence and confrontation. Margaret felt her pulse drum in her ears, but she did not falter. "I have served this house for years, Mr. Hastings. Loyalty is not something I take lightly." His eyes narrowed, searching hers for a sign of weakness. Finding none, he straightened, his expression shifting from anger to something colder. "Good, because if I find that anyone has stepped out of line, the consequences will be severe." The weight of the unspoken threat hung in the air as he dismissed her with a curt nod. Margaret walked out, her legs trembling with each step. She moved quickly down the hall, her breath shallow, until she reached the kitchen where Elise and Samuel waited with wide, anxious eyes. "What happened?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret looked at them both, the faces that had come to mean more to her than she ever thought possible. "We hold our ground," she said, her voice steady, carrying more strength than she felt. "And we wait for Joshua's move." The uncertainty hung between them like a storm cloud, but there was no turning back. In the quiet determination of that moment, Margaret knew they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The afternoon sun cast a muted glow over the mansion, painting the rooms with a deceptive tranquility. Margaret sat at the edge of her cot, her eyes unfocused as she stared out the small, narrow window that overlooked the side garden. The steady rustling of leaves in the breeze was usually soothing, but today it felt like a whisper of warning, a reminder that time was slipping through their fingers. The day's routine buzzed faintly in the background. Footsteps on the stairs, a distant clatter of china in the dining room, and the occasional sharp bark of Richard's voice somewhere beyond the reach of her small room. The confrontation in the study had left her shaken but resolute. There was no more room for doubt. Joshua's whispered promise before they had parted in the hallway resonated in her mind. "We will see this through." A soft knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. Samuel stepped in, closing it carefully behind him, his expression grave. "There's someone here, a man asking for you," he said, keeping his voice low. "He claims to be from the Times." Margaret's breath caught. She exchanged a glance with Samuel, whose usual steady demeanor now showed cracks of concern. "A journalist," she whispered, half to herself. The implications spun through her mind. Exposure, risk, and a chance. A dangerous, slender chance at the truth reaching beyond these walls. In the kitchen, the journalist stood out with his worn trench coat and a notebook clutched in one hand. He was middle-aged, with hair flecked with grey and eyes that seemed both weary and sharp. The staff bustled around him, casting curious, guarded glances. Margaret approached, hands smoothing over her apron as if it could wipe away her apprehension. "You must be Mrs. Thatcher," the man said, extending a hand. "Name's Harris. Thank you for meeting with me." Margaret's eyes flicked to Samuel, who nodded almost imperceptibly before stepping back to give them space. "I don't know what you've heard, Mr. Harris, but there are limits to what I can say," she began cautiously. Harris's eyes softened, a trace of sympathy warming his expression. "I know more than you think, Mrs. Thatcher. I've been investigating Hastings's dealings for months. Rumors, whispers. Nothing concrete until now." He glanced around, leaning in slightly. "But I believe you have what we need to bring him down." Her pulse quickened, and for a moment, the walls seemed to press in around her. The ledger, Joshua's part in this, the thought of her small, hidden world becoming the focus of public scrutiny was both terrifying and exhilarating. "It's not just about Richard," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "There are others involved, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their interests." Harris's jaw clenched. "Which is why we have to move quickly. Once this goes public, they'll have fewer places to hide." "But I need more than rumors. I need proof." Margaret's fingers brushed against the rough fabric of her apron, the crinkled edges of the hidden paper now feeling like a burning brand against her skin. "There is proof," she admitted, the words tasting of iron and resolve. "But getting it to you will not be easy." Harris nodded, his expression a blend of relief and urgency. "I'll be in town for the next 3 days. You know where to find me." As he turned to leave, Richard's voice, sharp and commanding, echoed from the front of the house. Margaret's breath hitched, and Harris paused, his eyes darting to the source of the noise. "Be careful," he said, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that spoke of experience with the dangers of the powerful. Margaret watched him leave, the tension in her chest not easing until the sound of the front door closing reached her. She turned to find Samuel and Elise watching her, their expressions mirroring her own turmoil. "What did he say?" Elise asked, her voice tight with worry. Margaret hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down like the roof itself. "We have a way out," she said at last, a flicker of hope sparking in her voice. "But it will take everything we have." Samuel's eyes hardened with determination. "Then we'll do it. We're in this together." The sun dipped lower as the day waned, casting long, finger-like shadows across the floors. The mansion, with its grandeur and secrets, seemed to hold its breath as Margaret, Elise, and Samuel steeled themselves for the storm they were about to unleash. The evening descended upon the mansion with an oppressive stillness, as if the house itself knew the turmoil brewing within its walls. Margaret moved through the corridor, the lamps casting elongated shadows that seemed to dance and mock with each flicker. The day's encounters had left her restless, the journalist's visit, and Richard's simmering tension coiling in her mind like a tightly wound spring. In the dining hall, the staff moved with practiced efficiency, setting the table for a dinner that promised nothing but more silent glances and guarded conversations. The board members, summoned earlier, had begun to trickle in, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors, their expressions tight with suspicion and whispered alliances. Richard stood by the fireplace, his profile outlined by the glow of the flames, a figure of authority and barely contained rage. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway, the sounds of porcelain and silverware a dissonant backdrop to her thoughts. The plan she had committed to, helping Joshua and, by extension, the journalist, felt both reckless and necessary. She recalled the years of quiet servitude, of bending without breaking, of listening and never speaking. But now, silence was no longer an option. Elise appeared at her side, her face pale. "He's on edge tonight," she whispered, nodding toward Richard, who had just turned to greet another board member with a thin smile that never reached his eyes. Margaret took a deep breath, the air heavy with the scent of roast meat and candle wax. "We must be careful, Elise, more careful than we've ever been." As the dinner unfolded, the conversation around the table was punctuated by sharp glances and coded phrases, each man at the table measuring his words. Margaret and Samuel moved through the room, their presence a seamless part of the background, eyes downcast but ears attuned to every word. "Delays will cost us everything," one board member muttered, his voice low but tense. Richard's response was swift, a veiled warning. "This is why trust is paramount, gentlemen. Betrayal is a luxury we cannot afford." The statement, pointed and deliberate, made Margaret's fingers tighten around the tray she held. She moved to set it down, her movements measured to mask the tremor in her hands. Samuel, who was refilling glasses nearby, caught her eye and gave the slightest nod. They were all bound together in this moment, a silent alliance forged by necessity. The dining hall's opulent decor, crystal chandeliers, oil paintings, the sheen of silver seemed almost gaudy now, a veneer that barely concealed the rot beneath. Margaret's thoughts raced. Joshua was somewhere in the mansion, waiting for the moment when they would act. The ledger, with its damning entries, had to reach Harris, the journalist, but the path to that end was fraught with risks. Richard's voice rose, commanding the attention of the room. "Let me remind you all that any loose ends will be dealt with swiftly," he said, eyes sweeping over the board members before resting momentarily on Margaret. The unspoken implication was clear, sending a ripple of fear through the room, though none dared to acknowledge it. Margaret's heart thudded against her ribs. The ledger was safe for now, hidden in a place only she and Joshua knew. But the longer they waited, the more the walls of the mansion seemed to close in, the stakes rising with every glance, every step. After dinner, as the guests trickled into the drawing room for brandy and conversation that masked deeper currents, Margaret slipped away. The narrow servants' staircase creaked beneath her feet, the sound swallowed by the muffled voices below. She reached her small room and retrieved the ledger, its presence both a comfort and a weight. The neatly inked columns and hidden transactions were not just numbers. They were the truth she had promised herself she would reveal. A knock at the door startled her, and she hid the ledger beneath her apron just as Joshua stepped into the dim room. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed by worry and resolve. "It's time," he said, voice tight. "Harris is waiting, but we need to be sure Richard doesn't suspect anything until the morning." Margaret nodded, the gravity of the moment settling over her like a heavy shroud. "I'll take it," she said, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her voice. "If anyone stops me, they'll think it's just another errand." Joshua's eyes softened, a flicker of admiration breaking through his tension. "You're braver than any of us, Margaret." She managed a small smile, one that felt foreign and fragile. "It's not bravery, Joshua, it's necessity." As she slipped through the servants' entrance and into the cool night, the mansion stood behind her, a fortress that had imprisoned truths for too long. The wind whispered through the trees, urging her forward, each step a defiance of the life she had known. Margaret held the ledger close, the weight of it a testament to the journey that had led her here. And with every stride, she felt the stirrings of hope, fragile but alive, as she moved toward a future that promised change. The night deepened, its silence pressing against the old mansion like a held breath. Margaret moved cautiously, the gravel path under her feet barely making a sound as she advanced toward the garden gate. The ledger was tucked securely within the folds of her apron, its weight a constant reminder of the step she was about to take. The air was cool, the scent of dew and fading roses lingering as she approached the tall, wrought-iron gate that separated the estate from the shadowed lane beyond. She glanced back at the house, its darkened windows like watchful eyes. Richard was somewhere inside, perhaps already suspecting that the delicate balance of power was shifting. The memory of his piercing gaze and veiled threats made her shiver, but the determination in her chest burned stronger than the chill. A rustle in the hedges caught her attention, and she stiffened, heart pounding. The figure that emerged was familiar, a shadow that solidified into Samuel. His expression was tense, eyes darting nervously between Margaret and the darkened grounds. "Margaret, we have a problem," he said, voice low and urgent. He stepped closer, his breath misting in the cool air. One of the maids overheard Crowley speaking with Mr. Hastings. "They know someone's been in the study." A cold wave of dread washed over her, but she pushed it down, steeling herself. "Then we don't have much time," she whispered. "I have to get this to Harris." Samuel's jaw clenched. "I'll go with you. It's too risky alone." "No," Margaret said firmly, her eyes softening with gratitude. "If both of us are missing, it will raise alarm. You need to stay, keep things steady." He looked as though he wanted to argue, but nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," he said, the worry in his voice a tether of friendship in the dark. Margaret gave him a fleeting smile before turning and slipping through the gate. The lane beyond was dim, flanked by high hedges that rustled softly in the night breeze. Each step she took felt weighted with consequence, but the urgency of her mission kept her moving forward. The narrow path led to the small park where Harris had agreed to meet her, a secluded spot edged by elm trees whose branches clawed at the sky. She spotted the journalist waiting, his silhouette outlined by the pale light of a lamppost. He stood with his hands buried deep in the pockets of his trench coat, eyes scanning the path as she approached. The tension in her chest eased slightly at the sight of him, a beacon of the justice she longed to set in motion. "Mrs. Thatcher," Harris greeted, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "You've come?" Margaret nodded, pulling the ledger from her apron and passing it to him. The moment the worn cover exchanged hands, a shiver ran through her, not of fear, but of the finality this act held. "This contains everything," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's enough to show the world what Richard Hastings truly is." Harris opened the ledger, his eyes scanning a few pages before looking up with a mix of admiration and resolve. "You've done something brave, Margaret. This will change everything." Before she could respond, the crunch of hurried footsteps echoed from the far side of the park. Both Margaret and Harris turned, the sudden realization of danger crackling between them like static. Out of the darkness, a familiar figure emerged, his face twisted with fury. Crowley. "You've gone too far," Crowley spat, his eyes wild as they shifted between the two. "Hand that over now." Harris stood his ground, clutching the ledger to his chest. "This ends tonight, Crowley. You won't silence this." Margaret's breath quickened, fear gnawing at her resolve, but she forced herself to stay rooted. The night felt colder, the space between them shrinking as Crowley advanced. His hand twitched, and for a heart-stopping moment, Margaret thought she saw the glint of metal, a weapon. Before any of them could react further, the sound of distant voices pierced the silence, shouts approaching from the edge of the park. Crowley's eyes darted toward the noise, hesitation flashing across his face. Harris took the chance and stepped back, pulling Margaret with him as they moved toward the deeper shadows of the trees. "Run!" Harris urged, his voice hoarse. Margaret's legs moved on instinct, the ground uneven beneath her as they slipped away from Crowley's reach. The voices grew louder, and with them, the faint glow of lanterns held by men who worked in the mansion, reinforcements. The chase had begun, but Margaret felt something shift within her, a kind of defiant freedom that pulsed with every step she took away from the chains that had bound her for so long. As the night closed around them, their breaths ragged and hurried, Margaret knew there would be no turning back. The path to justice was laid, and with it, the consequences that would soon follow. The moon hung low, casting pale, shifting light across the park as Margaret and Harris pressed deeper into the shadows. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, the urgency of their escape thrumming through their veins like a drumbeat. The distant shouts of Richard's men fanned out behind them, their lanterns slicing through the dark like searchlights. Margaret's heart pounded, not just from exertion, but from the enormity of what they had set in motion. The ledger, now clutched tightly in Harris's hands, was no longer a mere book. It was the key to freedom, a symbol of the power that had been hidden and hoarded by men like Richard for decades. Harris glanced at Margaret, his eyes sharp with determination. "We need to split up. They're closing in, and we can't both be caught." Margaret's initial instinct was to protest, but she knew he was right. The sacrifice had to be shared. She nodded, trying to summon a smile that wavered only slightly. "Find a way out, Mr. Harris. Make sure the world knows." He hesitated for a moment, searching her face as if memorizing it, then turned and disappeared into the darkened thicket. Margaret took a breath, the cool night air biting at her lungs, and moved in the opposite direction, the path ahead obscured by branches and patches of moonlight. The shouts grew louder, the snap of twigs and rustle of leaves telling her that they were close. She forced herself to keep moving, each step a reminder of the years spent in silence, the nights she had convinced herself that endurance was the only path. Tonight was different. Tonight, she was no longer just a witness. She stumbled into a clearing where the tall grass whispered secrets against her legs, and paused, listening. The voices had shifted, spreading out, confusion among them. A sudden movement behind her made her whirl around, heart in her throat. It was Samuel, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "I followed them when they left the mansion," he said, breathless. "They're searching everywhere, but they haven't seen Harris yet." Margaret exhaled, the relief momentary. "He's gone to find safety," she said, the ledger's absence now an ache in her mind. "We need to make sure they don't catch us before he gets far." Samuel nodded, but the question in his eyes was clear. What if they do? Before she could answer, a voice called out, close and sharp. "Over here!" The glow of a lantern swept across the clearing, catching on Samuel's jacket. Margaret's pulse quickened as she grabbed his arm. They moved, feet slipping over damp earth as they darted toward a grove of oaks that loomed ahead like sentinels. The chase was a blur, shouts, the beam of light chasing shadows, their own breaths mingling with the rush of blood in their ears. Margaret's foot caught on an exposed root, and she stumbled, Samuel's grip steadying her as they pressed on. The trees thickened, their branches clawing at the sky and shrouding the ground in darkness. A shout came from just behind them, and Margaret felt the chill of fear spike through her. They veered left, the path narrowing until they broke free into another patch of moonlight, but this time a figure stood waiting. Crowley's eyes shone with triumph, the sheen of sweat glistening on his brow as he raised his arm. "Thought you could run," he spat, taking a step forward. Samuel shifted, his stance protective, as if ready to shield her. "We won't let you take us back," he said, his voice tight with defiance. Crowley's lip curled. "I don't need both of you," he said, advancing. Margaret felt the weight of the moment pressing down, the choice that would seal their fates. She reached for Samuel's arm, squeezing it once, then stepped forward, drawing Crowley's attention. "Then take me," she said, meeting Crowley's eyes. "Leave him out of this." The silence that followed was broken only by the rustle of leaves and the thud of approaching footsteps. Crowley's eyes narrowed, weighing her words. Then, a distant commotion erupted behind him, voices shouting orders, the sudden bark of a command. "Get back here," someone yelled, and Crowley's head whipped around. In that heartbeat of distraction, Samuel lunged, pulling Margaret back into the thicket as chaos erupted around them. Lanterns bobbed wildly, the search fracturing as men shouted over each other, confusion splintering their pursuit. They kept running, their breaths ragged, until the shouts faded behind them. Finally, they stopped, hidden in a hollow where the light couldn't reach. Margaret's chest heaved, and she reached for Samuel's hand, squeezing it hard. The night held them, the only sound now their pounding hearts. The ledger was safe, and so were they, for now. But the battle was far from over. The truth had been set free, and with it, the promise of a reckoning that would change everything. The dawn sky bled into soft grays and purples as the first light stretched over the estate's sweeping grounds. Margaret sat in the hollow where she and Samuel had found refuge, her back pressed against the rough bark of an ancient oak. The chill of the night lingered, curling around her ankles and numbing her fingers, which she kept clasped tightly together to stop their trembling. Samuel sat a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the shifting sky, exhaustion etched deep into the lines of his face. They had managed to slip past Crowley and Richard's men, but their reprieve felt fragile, like the thinnest pane of glass. Every rustle of leaves or distant crack of a branch made Margaret's heart leap, the adrenaline refusing to ebb. She glanced at Samuel, who met her gaze with a faint, weary smile that spoke of shared relief and unspoken questions. "What happens now?" he finally asked, voice hoarse from the night's exertion. Margaret's eyes drifted to the horizon, where the mansion stood, its imposing silhouette still and silent, concealing the tumult within. "Now," she said, voice steadier than she felt, "we wait for Harris to make his move. If he reaches the Times, the story will break. But Richard won't let this go without a fight." Samuel nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment as if trying to grasp whatever courage remained within him. The quiet between them was broken by the sudden cry of a bird, sharp and startling in the dawn. Margaret's body tensed instinctively, and she scanned the woods for signs of movement. Instead, a figure stepped into view, familiar in its build and gait. Joshua appeared from between the trees, his face drawn but eyes alive with urgency. "Margaret, Samuel," he called softly, moving quickly toward them. The relief that washed over Margaret was palpable, though it did little to ease the thrum of anxiety coursing through her. "You're safe," Joshua said, a question and a statement combined. He glanced behind him, as if expecting to see Richard's men emerge from the woods at any moment. Harris got away with the ledger. "It's only a matter of time before Richard realizes what's happened," Margaret exhaled slowly, the tension loosening a fraction. "Then we need to be ready. Richard will come after everyone involved once he knows." Joshua's jaw clenched, the resolve in his eyes matching her own. "There's more," he said, a note of urgency sharpening his tone. "Richard's planning to move funds offshore by morning. He thinks he can cover his tracks before the story breaks." Samuel swore under his breath, the disbelief in his voice giving way to anger. "And he'll make it look like someone else is doing," he muttered. Margaret looked between the two men, a plan forming in the tangled chaos of her mind. "If we can delay him, make him believe there's a leak within his own circle, he might falter long enough for the story to break and the authorities to intervene." Joshua's eyes flickered with understanding. "But we'd need proof of his panic. Something concrete that shows he's trying to cover his tracks." A silence settled over them as they absorbed the risk. Margaret's pulse thrummed louder in her ears. the idea daring and dangerous. "The correspondence in his study," she said finally. "It'll have records, letters, enough to show he's trying to flee." Samuel's eyes widened. "But that room will be watched like a hawk now. Crowley won't make the same mistake twice." Joshua's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we'll make him look the other way," he said. "But we have to act fast." Margaret nodded, the decision crystallizing with each breath. The time for fear had passed. The servants, the whispers, the silent endurance of decades, all of it had led to this. It was a gamble, but one worth taking to reclaim the truth, to stand against the legacy of power that Richard wielded so ruthlessly. They moved with purpose, slipping back through the thinning woods toward the estate. The morning light sharpened, casting long, clear shadows that chased the night away. As they reached the edge of the garden, the sounds of the household stirring awake met them. Footsteps, the clatter of breakfast trays, the distant hum of conversation. Joshua nodded at Samuel. "Go to the kitchen. Act as if nothing's changed. Margaret and I will find our way to the study." Samuel hesitated, eyes flickering with concern, but Margaret squeezed his arm gently. "We'll be careful," she promised, though the tightness in her chest whispered otherwise. The corridor leading to Richard's study was silent, the light seeping through the windows, a cold reminder of the stakes. Joshua motioned for Margaret to wait as he peered around the corner. Seeing it clear, they moved forward, steps muffled by the thick Persian runner. Margaret's breath quickened as they reached the heavy oak door, its dark wood polished to a gleam that reflected fragments of their figures. She pressed her palm against the cool surface, the final boundary between fear and defiance. With one last shared glance, they pushed inside, ready to face whatever would come next. The study was cast in the muted glow of morning, with light filtering through the heavy curtains and pooling on the polished floor. The room smelled of varnish and faint traces of tobacco, a silent testament to the authority that resided within these walls. Margaret and Joshua stepped inside, closing the door with careful precision until only the quiet click of the latch echoed in the stillness. Margaret's eyes swept the room. The grand mahogany desk stood as the centerpiece, its surface strewn with papers that spoke of secrets and half-told truths. The ledger that Harris now held had been the first crack in Richard's carefully constructed world. Now they needed something more, proof that would show his desperation, his frantic scramble to save what remained of his empire. Joshua moved with the cautious grace of someone well acquainted with danger, his hands deftly sifting through the piles of correspondence. Margaret hovered near the window, eyes flitting between the garden and the hallway, listening for any sign that they'd been discovered. "Look at this," Joshua said, his voice low but sharp with urgency. He held up a letter, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. The handwriting was familiar, Richard's bold, slanted script, the ink smudged at points where impatience had pressed too hard. Margaret leaned in, the words jumping out at her in stark, accusing lines. "Transfer the remaining assets immediately. Trust no one. Any delay could cost us everything." The rest of the letter detailed account numbers and instructions, enough to implicate Richard in a scheme that stretched beyond the estate's walls. Margaret's throat tightened. The truth had never felt so tangible, so dangerous. A noise from the corridor snapped their attention away. Footsteps, quick and purposeful, echoed through the hallway, and a shadow passed beneath the door. Margaret's breath caught as she exchanged a glance with Joshua. The handle turned, slow and deliberate, and then the door creaked open. Richard stood there, framed by the doorway, his eyes narrowing as they took in the scene. For a moment, the silence was absolute, the room holding its breath. Then Richard stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a calm that belied the fury simmering beneath his surface. "So," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is where loyalty ends." Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, knuckles white. Joshua stood straighter, the letter still in his hand, refusing to hide the evidence that now stood between them and the man who had built his life on fear and control. "I should have known it would come to this," Richard continued, his gaze flicking between them. The old housekeeper and the idealistic grandson. What a story for the papers. Margaret felt the heat of defiance rise in her chest. "It's not just a story, Richard. It's the truth, and it's time the world knows what that truth costs." A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, crossed Richard's face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by cold calculation. He took a step closer, his eyes hard. "Do you have any idea what you're meddling with? You think exposing me will change anything?" "Power doesn't crumble with words." Joshua's jaw tightened, and he lifted his chin. "It might not crumble, but it shifts. People will see you for what you are." Richard's expression darkened, the room crackling with tension. He reached into his coat, and for one terrifying second, Margaret thought she saw the glint of a weapon, but then the door burst open, startling all of them. Samuel appeared, eyes wide with urgency, and behind him the sound of raised voices, the staff, the board members, and somewhere in the chaos, the call of Harris's voice cutting through. "It's over, Richard," Samuel said, breathless but steady. "The story is out." Margaret felt the weight of the moment descend on her, a rush of relief and fear mingling until she wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. Richard's eyes darted to the open door, the faint noise of commotion rising from below like a tide. His hand fell back to his side, the fight dimming in his gaze as realization set in. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of resignation. The house, once a fortress of whispers and obedience, seemed to shudder as the truth unfurled within its walls. Richard straightened, the proud set of his shoulders slipping as he turned toward the noise beyond the door. Margaret watched him go, her breath unsteady as the room seemed to exhale with them. Joshua set the letter down, the paper fluttering slightly before resting among the scattered evidence that would soon bear witness to the world outside. Margaret met Samuel's eyes, and in that shared glance she saw everything, the years of silence, the risks they'd taken, and the glimmer of hope that now dared to rise. The mansion, with all its opulence, felt smaller now, its shadows no longer suffocating, but lifting as the dawn pushed its first golden rays through the window pane. The echo of commotion outside the study ebbed and flowed, punctuated by the sharp voices of the board members and the staff, each caught between disbelief and urgency. Margaret stood frozen in place, the weight of what had just transpired pressing against her chest. The room, with its imposing bookshelves and shadows cast by the half-drawn curtains, seemed both familiar and strange, a witness to the unraveling of a powerful man. Joshua's hand rested on the letter, now stained by the sweat of tension. His eyes met Margaret's, a mixture of relief and exhaustion mirrored in his expression. Samuel lingered by the doorway, his breath coming in shallow bursts as he kept watch on the corridor. Suddenly, Richard's voice cut through the noise from below, loud and commanding, though with an edge that betrayed him. It was the voice of a man cornered, summoning what remained of his influence. Margaret felt a chill pass through her as she imagined the power he had wielded for so long now crumbling around him. Margaret took a deep breath and moved toward the hallway, her steps careful and deliberate. Joshua followed, his presence a reassuring weight at her side. The noise grew louder as they descended the stairs, the sight before them one of controlled chaos. The board members, men in tailored suits with expressions twisted by fear and indignation, huddled in clusters. The household staff watched from the edges, eyes wide and unsure. Richard stood at the center of it all, flanked by Crowley and two other associates whose loyalty seemed more uncertain with each passing moment. His gaze caught Margaret's, and for a second, the world around them seemed to pause. There was no mistaking the betrayal in his eyes, mingled with something that might have been grief, a fleeting acknowledgement of the decades she had spent in his service. "It seems," Richard began, his voice cutting through the din, "that some in this house have forgotten where their loyalties lie." The accusation stung, but Margaret stepped forward, the collective intake of breath from the staff rippling behind her like a wave. "Loyalty isn't blind obedience, Mr. Hastings," she said, her voice calm and clear. "It's built on respect and truth. And this house has seen neither for too long." A murmur swept through the room, and Richard's composure slipped, his hands clenching at his sides. Crowley shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to the open doorway where two police officers now stood, summoned by the urgency of Harris's evidence. The realization struck the crowd in increments. Harris's plan had reached the authorities, the ledger had spoken, and the tide was turning. Richard's mask of control cracked. "Do you think this will change anything?" he shouted, his voice hoarse with fury. "Men like me don't fall because of the mutterings of servants and half-truths." Joshua stepped beside Margaret, his presence an undeniable challenge. "This isn't about men like you, grandfather. It's about those you trampled to get here." The room fell silent, the weight of Joshua's words pressing down on every heart present. Richard's gaze faltered, and for a moment he looked diminished, an aging man clinging to the remnants of power. The officers stepped forward, one clearing his throat as the moment reached its crest. "Mr. Hastings, we need you to come with us," the officer said, his voice steady but firm. Crowley took a step back, the betrayal written plainly on his face as he realized there would be no cover for him in this storm. Margaret's breath shuddered out of her, the relief mingling with an exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. She watched as Richard was led away, his eyes finding hers one last time. There was no rage there now, only something hollow and distant. The room shifted, the crowd dispersing as reality set in. The staff moved in hesitant whispers, some darting glances at Margaret, others at Joshua. Samuel approached, his eyes shining with the emotions held back by the night's strain. "It's over," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "No," Margaret said softly, her eyes taking in the faces around her, the weary, the hopeful, the stunned. "It's just beginning." The mansion seemed to breathe for the first time in years, its walls absorbing the change, the echoes of what had passed filling its grand rooms. Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek, not for Richard, but for herself, for Elise, for Samuel, and for everyone who had endured in silence. The dawn outside grew brighter, spilling light through the windows and casting gold across the floor, a promise of what was yet to come. The echoes of the morning's upheaval reverberated through the halls of the mansion long after the police led Richard away. The estate, usually a fortress of silence, now thrummed with an unfamiliar energy. Margaret moved through the corridors slowly, her steps cautious, as if testing the fragility of this newfound reality. The staff she passed wore expressions of disbelief and cautious hope, their whispered conversations faltering when they saw her approach. She reached the small parlor where the staff gathered during rare moments of reprieve. Elise sat by the window, her face turned to the light, eyes red-rimmed but dry. Samuel stood nearby, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, a protective stance that spoke of the tension still winding through him. Margaret took a seat on the worn sofa, the cushions sinking under her weight as the room filled with a palpable quiet. Elise was the first to break the silence. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice barely audible, more a wish than a question. Margaret's gaze shifted to the window, where the morning sun had climbed higher, casting warmth onto the wooden floorboards. "They might," she admitted, "but not in the same way. The worst of it is behind us now." Samuel uncrossed his arms, leaning forward as if the truth of her words could steady him. I don't know how you did it, Margaret. All these years, holding on to something we all thought was impossible. A faint smile touched her lips, though it was tinged with sadness. I didn't do it alone, she said, her eyes sweeping the room, catching each of their gazes in turn. Every moment of silence, every task we endured, it was a part of this. The door creaked open, and Joshua stepped in, the lines of exhaustion deepening the shadows under his eyes. His presence, though weary, carried a weight of resolve. He looked at Margaret, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. There were no words to capture what they had shared, the risks taken, the sudden, shattering confrontation. Margaret, the journalist, Harris is outside, Joshua said. He wants to speak with you. She rose, the weight in her limbs lighter now, as if the years of servitude had lifted with the dawn. The parlor emptied as she made her way to the entrance, where Harris waited. His face was unreadable, a mask of professional distance marred only by the glint of determination in his eyes. "Mrs. Thatcher," he said, his voice formal, but with a tremor of something more. "The world will know what happened here, your voice, and that of everyone in this house. It will be heard." Margaret nodded, a lump forming in her throat as the reality settled over her. "It's not just my voice, Mr. Harris, it's theirs, all of ours." Harris's expression softened, and he took a step back, turning to leave with the assurance that the story, once buried under the weight of wealth and intimidation, would be told. The remainder of the day passed in waves, moments of disbelief followed by bursts of conversation. The estate felt different, as if its very bones had shifted, its rooms no longer bearing witness to secrets, but echoing with tentative laughter, the sound foreign but welcome. By late afternoon, Margaret found herself in the garden, where the air was sweet with the scent of late-blooming roses. She sat on the stone bench beneath the old elm, her fingers brushing the rough edge of its trunk, the quiet a balm after the storm. Samuel joined her, his expression lightening as he watched the sky, where the clouds moved in lazy shapes. "Do you think he'll fight it?" Samuel asked, breaking the silence. Margaret sighed, the question hanging in the air like an old habit they were trying to forget. "Richard won't go quietly," she said, a note of resignation tempered with certainty. "But he won't be able to hide from this. Not anymore." The branches above rustled as a breeze swept through, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. Margaret leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. In that breath, she remembered Thomas, his ledger, his quiet determination, the whispered dreams they had shared when life was simpler. She felt his presence now, not as a memory, but as a promise fulfilled. Samuel's voice pulled her back to the present. "We should celebrate, you know. Maybe not today, but soon. We need to mark this change." Margaret opened her eyes, meeting his with a small, true smile. "Yes, Samuel, we will. Not just for what we've done, but for what comes next." The sun dipped lower, casting the garden in a golden glow. The mansion, with its shadows receding and its past laid bare, stood quietly behind them. The day wasn't yet done, and neither was the journey, but for the first time in decades, Margaret felt the stirrings of hope, real, solid, and hers to keep. The air in the mansion shifted in the days that followed Richard's arrest. It was as if the house itself, burdened for decades with unspoken truths, had finally exhaled. The staff moved differently, less hurried, more present. Rooms that once felt suffocating now seemed to echo with possibilities. Their silence no longer heavy with secrets, but lightened by the absence of fear. Margaret sat at the large wooden table in the kitchen, the warmth of the stove casting a gentle glow on her lined face. The sounds of utensils clinking, pots simmering, and occasional bursts of conversation filled the room. Elise was at her side, folding linens with a smile that had become less rare in recent days. Samuel leaned against the counter, recounting a story from years past that, for the first time, felt safe to share openly. Margaret's gaze drifted across the room, taking in the faces that had stood by her when silence was their only protection. The sting of betrayal from Richard's final look lingered, but it was softened by the knowledge that they had done what was necessary. He had built his empire on the loyalty and silence of others, never imagining that those same people would find their voices when it mattered most. A knock at the door interrupted the moment, followed by the familiar figure of Joshua stepping into the kitchen. His coat was damp from the misty autumn air, and his eyes carried the weight of the days since his grandfather's arrest, tempered with a quiet determination. "Joshua," Margaret said, rising to greet him. The kitchen fell quiet as the staff watched, their anticipation palpable. Joshua's expression softened as he looked at her. "Margaret, they're moving forward with the investigation. The paper will run the story tomorrow, and the board has already started distancing themselves from Richard's dealings." A murmur swept through the room, a mix of relief and the realization that their world was truly changing. Margaret reached out, her hand clasping Joshua's in a moment that spoke of gratitude, solidarity, and the strange twist of fate that had made them allies. "What will happen to the estate?" Samuel asked, his voice cautious, as if afraid to hope too much. Joshua glanced around, meeting each gaze with a steady resolve. "The estate will remain, but its heart will change. I've spoken with the board. The staff's roles will be protected, and those who wish to stay will find a different place here, one not built on fear or coercion." Margaret felt a tightness in her chest give way, like the last ice breaking at the edge of a thawing river. The house, which had once been a symbol of silent servitude, would now be a place of shared history, reclaimed by those who had kept it alive. A voice called from the hallway, breaking the moment. It was Elise, eyes wide and bright, as she beckoned the others to follow her. "Come, they're reading the paper outside. It started." The staff poured into the garden, where the morning sun splashed across the damp grass. Harris stood at the gate, holding up the day's edition of the Times, the headline bold and unmissable: "Real estate titan Richard Hastings, arrested amid corruption scandal." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the group, and Margaret stood at the center, her hands folded, eyes fixed on the words that confirmed what they had all dared to hope. Harris stepped forward, handing the paper to her, and their eyes met, understanding passing between them without need for speech. The paper trembled slightly in her grasp, the ink smudged by her fingers as she read the article. Details of offshore accounts, testimonies from former associates, and corroborations from Harris's investigation laid Richard's empire bare. The weight of it all settled on her, not as a burden, but as a testament to the quiet strength it had taken to reach this moment. Margaret's throat tightened with emotion, and when she looked up, she saw that others were moved too. Samuel's eyes glistened, and Elise, who had once been so fearful, stood tall and unyielding. The garden, with its familiar paths and old trees, had never looked so bright. Joshua spoke, his voice steady and carrying over the group. "This is not just an end, but a beginning. For too long, this house held shadows. It's time for it to hold light." A tear slipped down Margaret's cheek, and she let it fall, unashamed. The path that had brought her here had been long, marked with sacrifice and silence, but it had also been rich with the bonds that made victory possible. The echo of her husband's voice, the laughter of the staff, and the whispers shared in the dark now felt like a chorus, guiding her forward. The mansion stood behind them, no longer an untouchable fortress, but a place ready to be reclaimed, stone by stone, story by story. And as Margaret looked at the faces around her, she knew they would do it together, for themselves and for those who had come before. The morning sun stretched further across the lawn, the promise of a new day, bright and unyielding. The aftermath of Richard Hastings' downfall unfolded like a storm clearing from a summer sky, leaving behind a landscape changed yet still recognizable. The mansion, once the seat of a man who commanded respect through silent compliance, now buzzed with a different energy. It was neither triumphant nor mournful, but something tentative, a space where hope struggled to find its voice amid the echoes of the past. Margaret sat by the bay window in the parlor, the thin lace curtains stirring with the breeze that carried the distant murmur of city life. She watched as Samuel and Elise moved through the garden, speaking in animated bursts and sharing a laugh that sounded almost foreign, like a language rediscovered. The sight of them, unburdened and free in a way they hadn't been before, filled her with a quiet warmth. Harris's article had done more than just expose Richard's misdeeds. It had sent ripples through the community that Margaret hadn't anticipated. Letters arrived daily, some from former staff who had long since left the estate, others from townspeople who had watched the Hastings family from afar, their admiration now tinged with newfound understanding. Each message was a testament to the power of truth and the courage it took to bring it into the light. Joshua entered the room, carrying a stack of documents and a weary smile. He set them down on the small table by the window, the papers rustling like leaves caught in a sudden gust. "They've begun reviewing the estate's finances," he said, eyes meeting hers with the steadiness that had grown between them. "There's talk of turning part of the mansion into a community space, somewhere open for gatherings and shared stories." Margaret's chest tightened with emotion. The idea of the grand, once intimidating halls, filled not with whispers of fear, but with voices raised in joy, was almost too much to envision. "It's fitting," she said, her voice steady. "Let it be a place where memories are shared freely, not hidden." Joshua nodded, his gaze softening as he watched her. "And you, Margaret? What will you do now with all of this finally behind us?" She looked out at the garden, where the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow on the leaves. The question settled over her like a quilt, familiar and comforting. For so long, she had been defined by service, by quiet resilience and sacrifice, but now the horizon seemed wider, beckoning with possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to dream. "I think it's time I remembered who I was before this house," she said, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Before I was a widow, before the years of routine. There are places I still want to see, stories I want to tell." Joshua's smile was gentle, understanding. "Then start with the stories, Margaret. The world needs to hear them." The afternoon unfolded with a peace that felt earned. Margaret joined the others in the kitchen, where the smell of fresh bread filled the air, mingling with laughter and the clatter of cups. Elise was kneading dough, her face flushed with the pleasure of simple work, while Samuel recounted an old tale of mischief that had the others grinning. Margaret listened, the rhythm of their voices a balm. She thought of Richard, now facing consequences that would echo long after today, and of the legacy he left behind, a cautionary tale about power wielded without empathy. She felt no triumph in his downfall, only the somber satisfaction that justice had found its way through the cracks of their lives. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden fingers across the room. Harris returned later that evening, his coat damp from the drizzle that had started as twilight set in. He carried another newspaper, its front page splashed with a follow-up to the story that had shaken the town. "The world is listening, Margaret," he said, placing the paper on the table where everyone could see it. The headline read, "Former Hastings staff speak out, a legacy of silence broken." Margaret traced the bold letters with her fingertips, the ink smudging slightly under her touch. The weight of the years, the secrets she had kept, and the moments she had wondered if courage was worth the price, all seemed to settle, then lift, leaving her lighter. Elise placed a cup of tea in front of Margaret, her smile wide. "To you, Mrs. Thatcher," she said, raising her own cup, voice brimming with sincerity. "To all of us." They toasted, the soft clinking of china echoing in the room. The rain pattered against the windows, a gentle, rhythmic sound that marked the close of a chapter. The mansion, once a place of shadows, now felt alive with the voices of those who had once only whispered. And in the center of it, Margaret sat, not as a servant bound by duty, but as a woman who had found her strength, and with it, the first true taste of freedom. The days that followed were quiet, yet not without their ripples. The mansion, once an emblem of control, now held an air of contemplation, its hallways no longer just corridors but paths where memories lingered. Margaret found herself waking each morning to a sense of peace that felt foreign but welcome. The ache of old fears, replaced by a tentative contentment. In the parlor, sunlight pooled in warm patches on the floor, catching the motes of dust that floated lazily through the air. Margaret sat with her embroidery in hand, the needle moving rhythmically as she stitched bright flowers into the fabric, each loop and thread a quiet rebellion against the grey years that had preceded this moment. Joshua entered, his footsteps soft, so as not to disturb the calm that had settled over the room. He carried a small wooden box, its corners worn smooth from age. Margaret looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mix of curiosity and affection. "I found this among my mother's things," Joshua said, placing the box on the table beside her. He opened it to reveal a collection of faded photographs and letters, the paper yellowed and fragile. "I thought you might want to see them." Margaret's breath caught as she reached out, fingers brushing against the edges of the past. The photographs showed a younger Richard, standing stiffly beside a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile, Joshua's mother, whose warmth had once filled the house with light before tragedy stole her away. There were letters too, written in a familiar, looping script that spoke of hope, dreams, and promises that had been silenced. Tears pricked Margaret's eyes, unbidden and sudden. She had loved Joshua's mother, seeing in her the spirit of someone unafraid to speak against the current. Her death had left a void not only in her son's life, but in the lives of those who served this house and found strength in her courage. "She was always kind," Margaret said, her voice trembling, even when kindness was scarce. Joshua sat across from her, his expression softening with shared memory. "I wish I'd known her better. But now, with everything changing, I feel like I'm starting to understand what she believed in. It wasn't the wealth or power, it was the people who made it all mean something." Margaret nodded, a small smile breaking through her grief. "She'd be proud of you, Joshua. You chose the harder path, and that takes a different kind of strength." The weight of the conversation settled between them like a blanket, warm but heavy. Margaret glanced out the window, where the garden bloomed with late autumn flowers. It had been months since Richard's arrest, but the world had not paused for their reckoning. Life moved forward, the seasons turning like pages in a book, each one carrying them further from the past. The sound of voices from the hallway drew their attention. Samuel and Elise entered, their laughter trailing behind them, bringing with it the scent of rain and the crisp bite of an approaching storm. Samuel set down a basket of fresh apples on the kitchen counter, his grin broad. "We are thinking of making apple pie," he announced, the casual declaration holding a sense of triumph. Small gestures, Margaret realized, had become acts of reclamation. The mansion was no longer ruled by quiet fear, but by moments that celebrated what had been reclaimed: choice, freedom, and the simple pleasure of being together. Elise's eyes lit up when she saw the open box on the table. "Are those from when Lady Hastings was here?" she asked, moving closer to peer at the photos. There was a reverence in her voice, a connection that had been buried but not forgotten. Margaret nodded, lifting one of the photographs for Elise to see. "Yes, before everything changed." Elise's gaze lingered on the image before she spoke, her tone wistful. "It feels like a different world, doesn't it?" "It was," Margaret said, her voice steady now, laced with acceptance. "But this world we're building now, is ours." The kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon and sugar as the apples were prepared, and the sound of their voices mingled with the clatter of baking dishes and the rustle of aprons. Outside, the wind picked up, tapping insistently at the windows, but inside there was warmth, laughter, and the quiet buzz of resilience. As dusk fell and the pie baked to a golden brown, Joshua lingered by the window, looking out at the first drops of rain. He glanced back at Margaret, who met his eyes with a look that spoke of everything unspoken: gratitude, hope, and a future yet to be written. The storm that had loomed over them for so long had passed, leaving in its wake not ruin, but the raw, open field of possibility. Margaret leaned back, savoring the scent of the pie, the laughter that filled the room, and the certainty that they had weathered the worst. And though the rain fell outside, inside, they were safe, together, and unbroken. The mansion stood resolute, its stone facade touched by the amber glow of the late afternoon sun. Within its walls, a different kind of life had taken root. No longer did its halls echo only with the footsteps of servants and the distant bark of orders. Now, laughter rang through the corridors, mingling with the soft hum of conversation and the creak of floorboards beneath shoes that no longer hurried in fear. Margaret walked through the West Wing, a place she once avoided for its proximity to Richard's office, where the air had always felt heavy with expectation and judgment. Now, it was filled with the rustle of papers as new plans were drawn up for a public gallery. The portraits that once celebrated wealth and power would share space with art that spoke of community and resilience. Elise joined her, a folder in hand and a wide smile on her face. "I spoke with the architect today," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "He believes we can open the gallery by spring. Can you imagine it, Margaret? People from all over coming to see what we've built here." Margaret's eyes softened as she placed a hand on Elise's shoulder. "It's more than I ever thought possible," she replied. The sense of wonder that filled the room was shared by both women, a reminder that they were no longer bound by the past, but architects of their future. A shadow shifted at the end of the hall, and Margaret turned to see Samuel approaching, his face aglow with a mix of pride and relief. He held a letter, the paper creased and worn from being read and reread. He handed it to Margaret, his eyes twinkling with unspoken news. "It's from Harris," he said. "The story reached further than we thought." Margaret unfolded the letter, her fingers tracing the familiar slant of Harris's handwriting. The words spoke of public interest, of letters to the editor praising the courage it took for the staff to stand up, and of inquiries into similar estates where silence still reigned. The world was listening, and for once, the stories of those who had always been unseen were being told. Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes as she read. The ache in her chest, long a constant companion, felt different now, less like pain and more like release. She passed the letter to Elise, whose expression shifted from curiosity to awe as she absorbed its contents. "People are writing about us," Elise asked, a note of disbelief lacing her voice. "About what we did here." Samuel chuckled, the sound deep and rich. "It seems we've become something of a symbol," he said, his tone half joking but full of pride. Joshua appeared from around the corner, having overheard their conversation. His presence, once a fleeting and tentative hope, now felt anchored, part of the house's very fabric. "The changes we made here are inspiring others," he said. "There are talks of reform, of ensuring that those who work in places like this are treated with dignity." Margaret met his eyes, and in them she saw the echoes of his mother's spirit, the compassion and determination that had been nearly suffocated by power but never entirely extinguished. "Your mother would be proud," Margaret said, the words falling between them like a blessing. Joshua smiled, a rare, unguarded expression that spoke of healing. "And so would Thomas," he replied, invoking the name of Margaret's late husband, whose quiet integrity had long been her anchor. The mention was a reminder that legacies were not always grand monuments, but the quiet acts of defiance and care that rippled through time. A knock at the main door reverberated through the house, pulling them from their shared moment. Margaret moved to answer it, the weight of history pressing lightly on her shoulders as she approached. A courier stood there, holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. "For Mrs. Thatcher," he said, tipping his cap before turning back down the path. Margaret took the package, its surprising weight solid in her hands. Back in the parlor, she set it on the table, untangling the string and unfolding the paper to reveal a framed photograph. It was an old picture, one she hadn't seen in years, Richard's daughter, Joshua's mother, standing with a younger Margaret and Thomas. They were in the garden, laughing, their faces turned to the light. A note slipped out from behind the frame, written in a hand that was unmistakably Richard's, to remind you that light found in shadows is the truest kind. The room fell silent, the meaning of the gesture settling over them like the final chords of a long-forgotten song. Margaret touched the edge of the frame, the weight of the past merging with the present. The mansion, once a fortress of silence, was now filled with the voices of those who had reclaimed it. And in that moment, surrounded by friends who had become family, Margaret knew that redemption wasn't just a singular victory, but a continuous choice. A story that began anew each day. The quiet of the late afternoon settled over the mansion like a gentle cloak, the world outside moving at its usual, unhurried pace. Margaret stood in the library, surrounded by the scent of old paper and the polished wood that had witnessed both the best and the worst of its inhabitants. The recent days had been filled with more than just change. They were laced with revelations that reminded her of the interconnected threads of their lives. The door creaked open, and Joshua stepped in, carrying a small, battered box. His expression was pensive, tinged with a sadness that seemed out of place against the backdrop of recent victories. Margaret turned, her fingers still resting on a well-worn ledger that had belonged to Thomas, a memento she kept as both a comfort and a reminder of resilience. "What is it, Joshua?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. He set the box down on the table between them, the wood groaning slightly under its weight. "I found this in my grandfather's old safe. It was tucked behind documents no one had touched for years." Margaret's brow furrowed as she reached for the box, the cool metal of the latch biting into her palm as she flipped it open. Inside lay a collection of letters, some still sealed, their paper yellowed with age. But it was a small journal that caught her attention, its cover cracked and softened from years of handling. Joshua nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an unspoken understanding. "It's my mother's," he said, his voice tight with the weight of that revelation. "It seems she kept notes, reflections, pieces of her life that no one knew." Margaret's chest tightened as she turned the first page, the delicate scrawl familiar and intimate. The entries spoke of days spent in the garden, of afternoons filled with laughter and the hope she harbored for Joshua. But deeper into the journal, the words grew heavy, shadowed by concerns and a discovery that set Margaret's pulse racing. There are things Richard hides from even his closest allies. I fear what will happen if anyone tries to bring them to light. But staying silent would mean being complicit. And I can't bear that thought, not with Joshua growing up in this house. The room seemed to close in around them, the air thick with the weight of the past, breaking free from its confines. Margaret looked up at Joshua, whose expression mirrored her own, a mixture of grief, anger, and understanding. She knew, Margaret whispered, the realization carrying both pain and solace. She knew what Richard was, and she tried to protect you. Joshua swallowed, his throat working as he nodded, and she paid the price for it. All these years, I thought her death was an accident. But now... His voice faltered, and he turned away, the burden of clarity sinking into his shoulders. Margaret stepped closer, the journal held against her chest as if it could shield them from the pain of its contents. Your mother was brave, Joshua. She wanted a better life for you, for all of us, and now, after everything, her voice is heard. The silence that followed was profound, filled only with the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Outside, the garden swayed gently in the breeze, oblivious to the secrets it had harbored and the truths it had witnessed. Samuel appeared in the doorway, his face somber but resolute. He glanced at the journal, then back at them. "There's someone here to see you both," he said, "a lawyer representing the Hastings estate." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. The last ties to Richard's legacy were frayed, but not yet severed. "We should go," she said, slipping the journal into her apron. The weight of it was a strange comfort, a reminder of the courage that had brought them this far. They made their way to the parlor, where an older man in a tailored suit waited, briefcase resting at his feet. He stood as they entered, his expression a practiced neutrality. "Mrs. Thatcher, Mr. Hastings," he said, nodding to each. "I'm here on behalf of Richard Hastings's estate." Joshua squared his shoulders, the fleeting vulnerability replaced by the stoicism that had become his armor. "And what business does the estate have with us now?" The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his eyes catching the light that filtered through the lace curtains. "Mr. Hastings left instructions in the event of his downfall," he said. "Among them, a final letter addressed to you both." Margaret's breath caught, and Joshua's fingers twitched, a momentary betrayal of the storm beneath his calm. The lawyer opened his briefcase and handed over an envelope, the seal broken but still intact enough to evoke Richard's imposing presence. Joshua took it, his jaw tight. The room seemed to shrink as he unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the page. Margaret waited, the moment stretching until he finally handed it to her, the tension in his face giving way to something undefinable. The letter, written in Richard's hand, spoke not of apologies or denials, but of an acknowledgement, however late it had come. "Margaret, Joshua, you were the keepers of what was true, even when I was not. For that, I lost not just power, but something far greater. Perhaps now the house can hold the light we never let in." Margaret's hand trembled as she lowered the letter, the room filled with an unfamiliar quiet, one not of silence, but of peace. The afternoon sun filtered through the large windows of the parlor, casting delicate, lace-like patterns onto the floor. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, the fabric worn smooth from years of use, a testament to quiet endurance and memories steeped in both sorrow and strength. The journal of Joshua's mother rested on her lap, its pages marked with the traces of a life interrupted too soon, but lived with fierce conviction. Outside, the estate was alive in a way it hadn't been for decades. The gardens, once a space reserved for formal events where conversation was guarded, now hosted children's laughter and the quiet conversations of neighbors who had come to visit. The gallery project was underway, with workers discussing plans and arranging supplies. their voices mingling with the faint song of the breeze rustling through the leaves. Samuel entered the room carrying a tray of tea, his movements unhurried, infused with the confidence that Margaret had seen grow over the past few months. He placed the tray on the small table beside her, the cups rattling softly as they settled. "There's a good crowd today," he said, nodding toward the window. "Seems word of the gallery's opening has spread quickly." Margaret smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. "It's a testament to what we've built here," she said, lifting the teapot to pour. The aroma of chamomile filled the air, soothing and familiar, and to what we've reclaimed. Samuel took a seat across from her, his gaze distant for a moment before returning to the present. "Do you ever wonder if Richard would have wanted this?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Margaret paused, the steam from her tea swirling upward like a question of its own. "I think, at the end, he saw more than just power and control. That letter, it wasn't absolution, but it was acknowledgement. And that's something." Samuel nodded, the answer settling over him like a warm quilt. They sipped their tea in silence, the quiet filled with an understanding that needed no words. Outside, Joshua's voice carried across the lawn as he spoke to visitors, explaining how the new space would be a gathering place for stories and art, a way to honor not just the house's legacy, but the lives interwoven with its history. A soft knock at the open doorway brought Margaret's attention back. Elise stood there, her eyes bright and a touch of mischief on her lips. "Margaret, there's someone here to see you," she said, stepping aside to reveal a familiar face. Harris, the journalist who had become more than just a chronicler of their struggle. He was now a friend, woven into the fabric of their story. Margaret rose, her heart lifting as she met his gaze. "Harris, what brings you here?" she asked, her voice carrying a warmth that had once been rare, but now came easily. Harris stepped into the room, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. "I couldn't stay away from the grand opening," he said, a smile creasing the corners of his eyes. "And I have something for you." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a book, its cover simple, the title printed in bold letters, The Voices of Hastings Hall. Margaret's breath caught as she took the book, the weight of it familiar, yet charged with the power of their story set free. She flipped through the pages, each word a testament to what they had endured and overcome. "You did it," she said, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You gave our story to the world." Harris's smile softened. "It was your story to tell, Margaret. I was just the vessel." Samuel's eyes shone as he reached for the book, running his fingers across its cover. Elise peered over his shoulder, eyes wide with pride and wonder. "Look at us," she said softly, as if speaking to the ghosts of their former selves. "We're part of something that can't be forgotten." The afternoon sunlight grew richer, the golden hue deepening as it spilled across the room, illuminating their faces. Outside, the laughter of children mingled with the murmured conversations of the townspeople who had come to see the change that had taken root in the once guarded estate. Margaret looked around the room, at Samuel's steadfast presence, at Elise's youthful hope that had been rekindled, and at Harris, whose pen had become as powerful as any act of defiance. And she thought of Joshua, now standing among the visitors, his mother's legacy living on through his actions and words. They had all come from different places, stitched together by a shared desire for truth, for dignity, and for light. She held the book close, the scent of fresh paper mingling with the distant aroma of blooming roses from the garden. The past was a part of them, inescapable and poignant, but it no longer dictated their future. They had taken their silence and turned it into a voice that echoed beyond the mansion's walls, reaching places and people they would never know. Margaret felt a tear fall, not from sorrow, but from the realization that they had not just survived, They had transformed. And in that moment, with the sun casting its golden blessing upon them, she knew their story was not just one of loss or endurance, but of reclamation, hope, and the unyielding belief that even in the darkest corners, light could find its way. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.